You've heard of the ghost of Tsushima, right? Maybe from the video game, maybe just in passing at school. But what no one told you, or perhaps didn't even fully know, is that the real story is even more intense, brutal, and inspiring than any fiction. Forget everything you think you know about samurais, honor, and invasions. What happened in 1274 was a slap in the face to logic. The greatest empire on earth, the Mongols, was advancing at full force against a people armed only with courage, bow and soul. So, why was this story kept hidden for so long? Why did the world forget the sacrifice at Tsushima, Japan's strategies, the atrocities committed, the signs from the heavens, and the unseen force that turned the tide? Maybe because it's easier to romanticize warriors than to face the real cost of resistance. But here, you're going to learn every detail, and you'll understand why, even centuries later, we can still feel the winds of that clash. The very same winds that changed the course of history and might just change the way you view courage. Once upon a time, on a morning heavy with mist and tension, the first whisper of danger echoed across the hills of Tsushima. The wind carried something strange, something that even the old monks couldn't explain. Along the shoreline, So Sukekuni, with eyes of steel and a soul of rock, watched the horizon. A colossal fleet was approaching, there with only 80 samurais. By his side, the man prepared to face the impossible. And between us, it wasn't just a battle. It was the birth of a legend. The sound of the Mongol drums, which resembled thunder, merged with the solemn silence of the Japanese warriors. Each one of them, there in Tsushima, knew the price of honor, and they were not about to pay it in fear. The invasion of Japan wouldn't be easy, they were sure. Between one prayer and another, they sharpened their blades as if preparing their spirit. Because deep down they knew, when death smiles, the samurai returns that smile with reverence. Just imagine, 80 against thousands. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? But for those men, there was no arithmetic that could outmatch Bushido. Their strength came from the unseen, from the blood of their ancestors, their traditions, a faith that even the fiercest Mongol would never understand. And here's the point. What drives a true defender of the homeland is not seen, it's felt. And on that island, it pulsed like an ancient war drum. They say that on that morning, the very spirit of the island walked among them. It was as if the true ghost of Tsushima had already been present before the first sword stroke. Every arrow released was laden with history, promises, and destiny. Sukekuni's gaze reflected not only courage, but the burden of protecting a people, an identity, a sacred land. And look, there isn't a fleet in the world that can scare a man who has already died inside to defend what he loves. The sky darkened, and the smell of salt mixed with that of distant smoke. There they came, the dreaded Mongol warriors, with their flags, fluttering like shadows from another world. And even so, the samurais didn't take a single step back. The resistance was not just physical, it was spiritual, it was ancestral. Little did they know, however, that epic confrontation in Tsushima was only the beginning of the true nightmare that was coming. It was the year 1274, when the sea ceased to be just a sea. The waves began to carry something monstrous, a colossal armada with over 1,000 ships and about 20,000 soldiers among Mongols, Koreans, and Chinese. Imagine seeing that coming your way. It looked like a floating wall, a living threat. And where did they land first? Yes, once again, on the battered Tsushima. Japan was about to feel the weight of the most feared empire of the time. The choice to attack via Tsushima was no coincidence. The Mongols, as cunning as ever, knew that this small island was the gateway to the soul of the archipelago. Bringing it down would be like opening a tear in Japan's armor. With every stroke of the oars, the drums beat with more fury. It wasn't just an invasion. It was a message. We're here to take it all. And the most curious part, many of those ships weren't made merely of wood, but of fear, of stories carried by the winds, of rumors about warriors with never-missing bows. It was as if the very ocean conspired with the invaders. The Mongols, who had already toppled empires, wanted more. They wanted Japan submissive, but they hadn't counted on the strength of a people who wore pride like armor. Tsushima, barely recovered from the first clash, became the stage for a second nightmare. The village bells barely rang before being silenced by arrows. The samurais, for their part, did not waver. Even facing an enemy so numerous, their spirit did not falter, because there, on that small island, every man was a living wall. But when the ship sailed toward the island of Iki, terror spread like wildfire across parched fields. And what to say about the precision with which the Mongols advanced? Their maps, their logistics, everything was surgically planned. It was not just brute force. It was a strategy game, as if every step had already been written. The Armada moved on, unstoppable, as if Japan's destiny was about to be rewritten with fire, arrows, and steel. And it was on Iki that the contrast in tactics began to reveal the true clash of worlds. Back then, war was not just about strength, it was philosophy. On one side, the Japanese samurais, molded for generations by the Bushido Code, where honor, duels, and personal skill were sacred. On the other, the Mongol Empire, with its collective, strategic, and brutally efficient mentality. It was as if two distinct, almost incompatible worlds collided with surgical violence. And the stage? Once again, the fated island of Tsushima. The Mongols weren't coming to fight, they were coming to crush, and they did it with an almost mathematical coldness. First, they sent their Korean and Chinese troops as cannon fodder, absorbing the samurai's arrows. Then they unleashed the feared Mongol horse archers, swift, lethal, relentless. They didn't engage in duels, they hunted. And the contrast with the samurais could not have been starker. While the Japanese warriors called the enemy to fair duels, the Mongols were already flanking and firing on the move. It was a kind of warfare that left no room for poetry. The shouts of "Come face me" were answered with a rain of arrows. And every shot proved that Japan would have to learn fast that the world had changed, and that the codes of honor might not survive the shock of reality. Yet, the samurais persisted. Because for them, it wasn't just a matter of winning, it was about not surrendering to foreign molds. The battlefield turned into a classroom where every arrow received was a harsh but necessary lesson. And like any good student, Japan began to observe, analyze, and learn. The resistance was fierce, yes, but it was also smart. And in the eyes of the samurais, the spark of adaptation began to emerge. Tsushima and Iki became more than battles. They turned into mirrors, reflecting the Japanese' own vulnerability. But it was also there that a new kind of warrior was born, one who learns in the midst of the fight. The war raged on, relentless, and what came next wasn't just confrontation, but also signs from the heavens, as if destiny itself decided to get involved, announcing something greater than men and armies. Even before the second invasion touched Tsushima's soil, signs began to manifest. A mysterious fire consumed part of the Hachiman shrine, the god of war, as if the very heavens were sending a fiery warning. And shortly after, flocks of pigeons appeared, circling restlessly like messengers from beyond. For the inhabitants, that wasn't a coincidence. It was a living prophecy. Japan, once again, was about to be tested by the claws of the Mongol Empire. No matter how the numbers worked against them, the samurais stood firm. It was as if every spark of fear was swallowed by a sea of determination. The flame of duty burned fiercely in the warriors' hearts, and not without reason. They knew they weren't fighting just for territory, but for the soul of Japan. And amid war cries and silent mantras, the resistance took shape like a contained storm. The most beautiful and tragic part is that even when faced with the enormity of the threat, no one ran. The samurais of Tsushima rose once more, with armor and spirit ablaze. It was as if the fire in the temple had been transferred right into them. And between us, when an entire people begin to believe they are fighting with divine blessing, history changes its course. The Mongols, despite their immense force, were treading on sacred ground. Families, elders, even children knew that something out of the ordinary was about to happen. Bonfires were lit by the seashore not just to keep watch, but to keep hope alive. Every glance at the sky was a disguised prayer, a plea for intervention. The island, though small, vibrated like a ceremonial drum, and when the ships approached, they didn't find just soldiers. They found an entire people engaged in spiritual resistance. It was as if the ghosts of Tsushima, the ancestors, the gods and generations past, had returned to watch the scene. A new invasion was approaching indeed. But what was to come was not just battle. It was an epic showdown on the edge of faith, tradition, and survival. And in the heat of that first impact, when arrows cut through the wind for the last time, the ground trembled, announcing the fiercest clash that beach had ever seen. The beach of Tsushima turned into an arena. The sand, once molded by calm waves, was stained with blood and trampled by galloping horses, so Sukekuni did not hesitate. With his archers in position, he transformed that stretch of land into a true field of resistance. And no matter how fiercely the Mongols advanced like a raging tide, they tasted the bitter flavor of Japanese daring. The samurai arrows sliced through the air with pinpoint precision, hitting the first invaders even before the complete landing. It was as if the island itself was shouting, "You shall not pass." One of the names that echoes from this fight is Saito Sukesada, who charged with fury and honor, toppling enemies as if cutting bamboo. He knew he wouldn't return, and yet he did. Because for him, dying while fighting was the same as living forever, but don't think it was a victory. No, it was a dignified farewell. The samurais fell one by one, like pillars refusing to collapse without a fight. And when all seemed lost, Sukekuni led his final charge, a suicidal mounted assault toward the heart of the Mongol troop. It was like watching a wildfire hurl itself into the sea. And there, in that final collision, the island's fate was sealed. With the end of the cavalry, the Mongols finally conquered Tsushima, but not without first understanding that the cost of victory can be high, even for an empire. The shouts, the torn banners, the clashing steel, everything became etched into the memory of those beaches, and while the bodies were left under the sun, the invaders turned their gaze to the next island, Iki. The journey of destruction was far from over. With every step the foreign soldiers took, the shadow of Japanese sacrifice stretched further. The ghosts of Tsushima, now real, walked invisibly alongside the survivors, as both lament and warning. And as the ships prepared to set sail once again, the whispers of what had happened there echoed through the masts. Because a battle can be won, but certain forms of resistance, my friend, simply never die. After the drums of war fell silent in Tsushima, the true nightmare began. And no, it wasn't battle anymore. It was cruelty. The Mongols, now in control of the island, showed an even darker side. Entire villages were reduced to ashes. Women and children, barely understanding what was happening, became tragic symbols of a merciless war. Accounts say that the Mongols tied women to the masts of their ships as grotesque displays of power. A scene so brutal that not even the winds of Japan could erase it from the survivors' memory. It was as if terror had been institutionalized, used as a psychological weapon. The message was clear: whoever resists will be destroyed, even in their dignity. And with every mile conquered, that fear spread further. Temples were looted, bodies left as warnings along the roads, and hope, well, that had to hide for a while. What was once home turned into a cemetery. Tsushima, which had bravely resisted, was now a land of mourning. But let no one think that this was the end. The invaders' fury had another destination. The next point on the map to bleed was the island of Iki. To the eyes of those watching from afar, it seemed as if the whole of Japan would be swallowed by this foreign tempest. But for those on the ground, it was the end of everything they knew. The ghosts of Tsushima, now joined by new souls, were beginning to form, not as hauntings in the conventional sense, but as an invisible force fueling the desire for resistance. And that desire would travel to Iki, along with the rumors of horror. At the tip of the Mongol sword, there was no room for mercy. And with every devastated village, history was soaked in pain. Fear turned into tradition, anger a seed. Because no matter how many temples they destroyed, fire and steel can't annihilate a culture. And what was about to unfold on Iki would prove exactly that sometimes pain is what ignites the last sparks of courage. After the nightmare in Tsushima, the winds of terror blew toward the island of Iki. There, shouldering the burden of resistance, was Taira Kagetaka, a man surrounded by fear, courage, and impossible choices. With no great fortresses, few men, and the Mongol shadow approaching like a tsunami of steel, he knew time was not on his side. Yet he prepared himself, because honor in Japan is worth more than any wall. Hinotsume was more a refuge than a castle. Fragile walls, tired soldiers, scarce hope. But even so, Taira Kagetaka didn't run. He gathered whoever he could, armed those who remained, and locked himself in with his family to confront destiny. Outside, the Mongols prepared their final card, using prisoners as human shields, a cruelty without measure, and a choice that would weigh like lead on the Japanese soul. Just imagine fighting with a heart torn between duty and despair, seeing familiar faces being used as protection by the enemy, and yet standing firm. Taira knew the end was near, but he refused to let the Mongols take his dignity. Together with his family, he sealed his own fate with a decision that would echo for centuries. They committed seppuku, ritual suicide, embracing death with more dignity than life could ever offer. This act, though tragic, was not in vain. It was a symbol. It was resistance. It was Iki's final message to the rest of Japan. They may win on the field, but they will never win our spirit. As the invaders took what remained of the island, that message traveled, along with the few survivors, to the continent. The ghosts of Tsushima now gained siblings, and the winds carried whispers of a silent uprising. What happened there was not just another fall, it was a seed. The pain of Iki spread through the fields, the ports, the homes, and amid the ashes and destruction, a legend was born about a young girl who dared to attempt the impossible, to cross enemy lines to seek help. A daughter, a warrior. A separate tragedy that deserved its own chapter. In the midst of chaos, where hope seemed an unattainable luxury, emerged the figure of Katsura Hime, the daughter of Taira Kagetaka. Young, yet with the courage of 1,000 warriors, she was tasked with an impossible mission: to cross the hell that Iki had become and seek aid on the continent. A girl against the Mongol Empire. Can you believe it? Sometimes the greatest acts of heroism don't come from swords, but from silent steps. In the dark, she set off without armor, yet with a burden heavier than any warrior could carry. While cries echoed in the distance and the smell of smoke hung in the air, Katsurahime ran along the trails, trying to evade enemy eyes. Every step was a prayer, every shadow a threat. And still, she pressed on. Because when the soul carries a purpose, not even the ghosts of Tsushima dare to stand in its way. Unfortunately, fate was cruel. Katsurahime never reached her destination. The journey was too long, too dangerous, too brutal. But even so, she fulfilled her role. For the few who escaped, Iki carried her story with them, and with it, the island's cry for help. She wasn't rescued, but she saved memories, and in the end, that's what kept the flame of resistance alive. Her name echoed in villages and temples, not as a princess, but as a symbol, not as a martyr, but as a messenger. Katsura Hime became a story whispered by survivors and remembered in prayers. A short life, but with an eternal impact. Because in the end, what are battles without the people who make them human? And as the survivors carried the accounts of what happened in Tsushima and Iki to the continent, rumors merged with myths, and the winds began to change. Something bigger, something no one could foresee, was emerging on the horizon. A new kind of force, a new kind of defense, not of swords, but of the skies. Barely had the survivors buried their dead when the threat returned. In 1281, the Mongols came back with even more strength. About 140,000 soldiers, hundreds of ships, devastating weapons. It was the largest maritime army ever seen up to that point. Japan, already wounded, braced itself to be crushed. But what no one expected was that the very heavens had different plans. And they blew, my friend, with a fury even the Mongol Empire had never known. The Japanese called it kamikaze, the divine wind. A powerful typhoon suddenly formed and descended upon the enemy fleet as if it were a curse from the gods. Ships were split in half, soldiers hurled into the sea, and the dream of conquest sunk. It was as if the very ghosts of Tsushima had been blowing from above, avenging every fallen soul. And this time, it wasn't steel. It was the spirit of the land that prevailed. But make no mistake, it wasn't all celebration. Even with the fleet's destruction, fear still lingered. Japan had won, yes, but it was internally in ruins. Every victory cost more than just blood. It cost innocence, peace, and the certainty that the world beyond was far more cruel than the tales claimed. The Mongol would not return. But the trauma that remained etched into the nation's very core. And, as history loves its irony, Japan, which had suffered so much from invasions, began to fight back in its own way years later. Japanese pirates, known as woku, started attacking Chinese and Korean ships in response, spreading chaos across the eastern seas. It was as if the children of those who resisted in Tsushima and Iki were saying, "Now it's our turn." And the cycle of war, as always, turned once again. Even so, the feeling was one of miracle. Because no matter the size of the empire or fleet, when a people's faith blends with the unexpected force of nature, even the greatest armies tremble. Japan not only survived, it was reborn. And the memory of that sacred typhoon became a symbol of divine protection. But what truly remained were the names, the faces, the stories that refused to vanish with the tides. Today, those who set foot on the islands of Tsushima or Iki might never imagine what the soil holds. But for those who listen with their hearts, the ancient echoes can be felt in the trees, in the temples, in the stones. There are memorials, indeed discreet, silent, yet as powerful as a well-launched arrow. They are tributes to those who gave everything, even knowing they wouldn't return, because courage, when it's real, does not die with the body. There, every statue seems to whisper a story. Every altar carries more than flowers. It carries promises. Samurai blood became a root, and legends turned into the foundation of Japanese identity. To this day, the names of the Tsushima heroes are revered with respect, not only for their bravery, but for teaching Japan what it means to resist when all seems lost. And between us, that's worth more than 1,000 swords. But the scars remained as well, not only on the land, but in the souls of the people. The Mongol invasion shook everything: politics, spirituality, culture. It was a turning point that shaped what Japan would become in the following centuries. The sense of vulnerability became an eternal warning, and the fear of new invasions never completely disappeared, even if the danger had passed. That tension, by the way, paved the way for another response: retribution. Japanese pirates, known as woku, began attacking Chinese and Korean ports and ships with fury. It was as if the ghosts of the islands had taken the helm and set sail in search of justice. The pain transformed into action, the loss became fuel, and the memory of those dark days not only survived, it spread. Time passed, empires changed, the winds shifted, but the names of Sosukekuni, Kagetaka, and Katsura Jaime still echo, not as victims but as symbols. Symbols of a people who, even in the face of the era's greatest military power, did not bow down, who used arrows, fire, and faith to write their history. And in the heart of Japan, even today, the true ghost of Tsushima lives on. Now that you know the true weight carried by the word resistance, what are you going to do with it? Will you continue ignoring the silent battles that take place within you every day? Or will you finally unsheathe your inner sword and fight for what you believe in? Because, let's face it, if 80 samurais in Tsushima faced the greatest empire in the world with nothing but honor, you too can face your challenges with the same courage. How many times have you let fear take the helm? How many times did you bow without even trying? The story of these Japanese heroes isn't just about the past, it's a mirror for our present. And maybe your very own divine wind is just waiting for you to take the first step. So tell me, what battle do you need to face right now? If this story touched you in any way, leave your comment down below. I want to hear your opinion. And of course, if you want to keep learning incredible stories like this one, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Because here, we don't just tell stories to entertain, we tell them to transform.